I found the perfect brisket rub, but it's not actually this one. It's actually this one. This is a rub that I developed that's based on Lawry's seasoned salt, but it's tweaked specifically to cater to the unique profile of a brisket. Guys, in this video, we're going to talk about why Lawry's seasoned salt is being used by the top barbecue pitmasters in the world to make the best briskets in the world, and how you can use that knowledge to make your own rub that will have your family honestly telling you to start your own barbecue restaurant because your briskets are going to be so dang good. So let's get smoking. Okay, why are we talking about Lawry's? Well, Lawry's seasoned salt is a seasoning salt with a history that goes back about 80 years to 1938 when a guy by the name of Lawrence Frank started a restaurant called the Prime Rib. And one day this guy Lawrence, they called him Lawry for short, that's why it's called Lawry's seasoned salt. He developed this special blend of spices and salt, and he used it to finish his prime rib on. So when the prime rib was being sliced right at the table for the diners, they would season the prime rib with the Lawry's seasoning salt. And people went insane over it. They even went so far as to steal the special salt blend and take it home, and they started putting it on everything from casseroles to corn. Eventually, half a century or more later, people started using it on brisket to season it. And eventually it got so popular, they started selling it commercially. It started getting used in restaurants and in every household, and the brand eventually got purchased by a bunch of different owners. It's now owned by McCormick's, but most importantly for the purposes of this video, it started getting used by barbecue restaurants. In particular, it started getting used by a guy by the name of John Lewis, a famous pitmaster who in a Texas Monthly interview said that he used Lawry's seasoning salt in addition to like mustard and pickle juice and coarse grained salt and pepper and garlic powder on his briskets to make his awesome briskets. And even more recently, it's been used by Goldie's Barbecue by a guy named John White. He's one of the pitmasters there. His nickname's Jerby. He does a bunch of videos on YouTube. You can check him out. I'll link him. You'll see that he uses this this Lawry's seasoned salt in addition to salt and pepper to really amp up the flavor of his briskets. Goldie's actually won first place in the Texas Monthly Top 50 barbecue joints in 2021. So you know this isn't just a passing fad. This is something that's used by the best pitmasters in the world, and it's here to stay. So I want to explore why Lawry's seasoned salt is so good on brisket. What are its secrets? And in order to do that, we need to do some nerd dad science. Nerd dad science. Nerd dad science coming at your heart. Now the ingredients are generally listed in order of quantity. So it's got a lot of salt, it's got a lot of sugar, and then it's also got some quantity of paprika, turmeric, onion powder, cornstarch, garlic powder, anti-caking agent in it that's irrelevant. It's got sunflower oil, paprika extracts, that's basically to make it more red. Most barbecue spices that look red have that in it. And it's got natural flavor. Now, there's a lot of mystery surrounding what natural flavor is. In a lot of cases, companies tend to hide glutamates or MSG in their spices under different names like yeast extract or hydrolyzed soybean oil or 100 of different names like that to mask the fact that they're actually containing glutamates. But I really wanted to test if there's actual MSG in here. Even though they're saying there's no MSG, I wanted to make sure they're not lying to us. So I used some MSG testing strips to test whether there was the presence of any glutamates in Lawry's seasoned salt, and the results were a little bit inconclusive. You can see on these test strips that the one with soy sauce and the one with pure liquid MSG, they obviously are purple in color or more purple. But the ones with the Lawry's that I tested, I boiled some Lawry's in water and then tested them using the test strips. They're not purple, but they're kind of a little bit more towards the purple side. And the test strips seem to indicate that could be an indicator that there is some portion of glutamates or some quantity of glutamates in the sample. But I think that additional color is just coming from the fact that there's all these red colorants from paprika in the Lawry's. So I don't really think that Lawry's has any MSG or glutamates in it, whether added or hidden in any way. It's getting its magic taste from a couple of different things. What are those things? Well, the first one is pretty apparent as soon as you open up the lid of one of these packages. You can smell celery salt or celery seed powder right away. And it's not specifically mentioned on the ingredients label, but if you look on the McCormick's website for Lawry's seasoned salt, it will specifically say that they used ground up celery seed. So that one is pretty easy to spot. The second thing is pretty obvious too if you're used to dealing with a lot of barbecue spices. You'll notice right away that this thing is really heavy. It's a lot heavier than a lot of other spice containers. That tells me that there's some really finely powdered salt or sugar in here, and that's adding a lot of mass to what's in here. It's probably why this is more expensive than other salt and sugar products, because it's just got a lot more product packed into a smaller volume of area. And that is a very important thing, because if Lawry's seasoned salt is using really fine-grained salt and really fine-grained sugar, that is going to add a lot more surface area to what's hitting your tongue, and you're going to experience a lot more saltiness, a lot more sugariness per square inch using this rub than you would using just coarse-grained pepper and coarse-grained salt alone. But how do we know for sure? Because I want to make a recipe that is as similar as Lawry's as possible so I can start adding stuff to it to make the perfect brisket rub. But in order to do that, I need to know what size of grains of salt and sugar I should be using. Should I be using coarse-grained salt? Should I be using table salt? Powdered salt? Should I be using regular table sugar? Should I be using finely granulated or powdered sugar? In order to find out exactly what size the particles of salt and sugar are in this Lawry's, we need to use a microscope. Okay, what we're looking at here in the microscope is a few grains of kosher salt. Take special notice of their size. This is what we typically use on a brisket. It's way less salty than regular table salt because the particles of salt are much larger. Now, let's look at some table salt in comparison. You'll notice that the particles of salt are much smaller. It's more salty on your tongue because of this, because it has more surface area. So if you've ever tried to use just regular table salt in a brisket rub, you'll notice that your brisket is a lot saltier. And now if we go even finer, we're looking at popcorn salt right now. This is extremely small, and as a result, it's extremely salty. That's why it's used on popcorn, so it can stick to the popcorn and it can provide a ton of saltiness per square inch. Okay, now that we have a baseline comparison for the salt, let's take a look at sugar. What we're looking at right now is just regular, I call it table sugar. It's just regular granulated sugar. It looks about the same size as the table salt you saw before. But if we look at something like castor sugar here, it's also called confectioner's sugar or superfine sugar. It's much smaller in size. It's about half the size of the granulated sugar. So now the big question, what does Lawry's look like under the microscope? Well, here it is, and you'll immediately notice that there's these large square particles that are uniform and square, and they look a lot like the table salt I just showed you. Now, it's really hard to tell sugar and salt apart when you're looking at it this closely, but we can tell from the past look that we had at the table salt that this is probably table salt, at least these square particles are. Now, the second thing to look at is kind of between these bigger particles. There's some smaller particles that are kind of gem-shaped, and they're a bit more clear than the larger particles. This is probably sugar, and it looks the most like the confectioner's or castor sugar we just looked at, which is, as you'll recall, one size down from regular table sugar, or also called granulated sugar. Now, there's also some things in here that make me wonder whether there's also regular granulated sugar in here, because there's these big round pieces with the edges knocked off and they're almost like spherical in shape. But those could also be salt. And it's also possible there's very finely powdered salt in here, like popcorn salt. But based on my analysis and all of the comparisons that I've done, my best guess is that regular table salt and castor sugar are probably the sizes of salt and sugar we're looking at. Now that we know the secret of Lawry's, it's time to make the perfect rub with that knowledge. Start with 1 tablespoon plus 1 teaspoon of table salt, then add 1 teaspoon of castor sugar, 1 teaspoon of paprika, a half a teaspoon of celery salt, a half a teaspoon of onion powder, a half a teaspoon of garlic powder, 1/4 teaspoon of turmeric, and 1/4 teaspoon of cornstarch. Now at this point you basically have a Lawry's Copycat recipe, but we're gonna add 2 more ingredients just to kick it up a little bit. And those ingredients are half a teaspoon of fine ground pepper to ensure you get an even peppery taste across the brisket, and half a teaspoon of chili powder to give it a bit of a spicy kick. Now the second step is to use some coarse grained black pepper and some kosher salt to give the rub its distinctive Texas style flavor. So to do this, we're going to add 2 teaspoons of the Lawry's Copycat recipe into a shaker bottle, and then we're gonna add 4 teaspoons of kosher salt and 8 teaspoons of coarse ground black pepper. Now, if you wanna scale up the amount of rub you're making, just keep in mind that the ratio is 2 part Lawry's to 4 parts kosher salt to 8 parts coarse grained black pepper, but I like to keep the amount of rub small, and I only measure enough to use on 1 brisket for a very important reason. If I just started shaking up the rub and sprinkling it over the brisket, you might get some of the powdery Lawry's particles like the cornstarch and the onion powder soaking up all the moisture on the brisket, and then the pepper and the kosher salt, the larger particles, can't really stick that well. Or you could get the opposite where you're getting a really uneven amount of rub across the entire brisket, where you're pouring out all of the pepper, and then all you're left with at the bottom is the Lawry's, the powdery stuff, and then you have one side of the brisket that is way saltier than the other side, or way peppery. So I just put enough in the shaker bottle for 1 brisket, and I start by shaking out the large particles on the top, so the large grains of kosher salt and pepper on the brisket, and I do one side first, and then I do the other side. And by the time I do that, all that's really left in the shaker bottle is the more finely powdered Lawry's. Then I just repeat the process, and I do one side again and the other side again, and I get a nice even coating. I don't have any issues with some of the rub not sticking, and it's perfectly coated. If you do want some extra pepper, like I like my briskets really peppery, then you can just add as much as you want to the top before you're done. So in this case, I added a little bit more pepper just to give it a little bit more of a peppery taste. The other way to do this, of course, is you just add the largest particles, which are the coarse grained black pepper first, so 8 parts of that black pepper, and then you add the second smallest particle, which is the kosher salt, so 4 parts of kosher salt, and then lastly, you add the Lawry's, which is the smallest particle, and that will ensure that you get a nice even coating. I just like to have it all in one shaker bottle and use this method because it's just much more efficient. Now, when you use this rub, the results are amazing. You get the saltiness that's evenly coating the entire brisket, you get the peppery flavor, and you also get that really savory taste from the celery salt in the Lawry's and the chili powder and the onion powder, the garlic powder. It just hits your tongue in a really different way than just using salt and pepper. If you guys want to nerd out about Lawry's Copycat recipes or brisket rub, then check out my Patreon page. I'll link it in the description section below. We're building an awesome community there of people that are like-minded and committed to getting better at barbecue, and you'll have direct access to me through our Discord chat server, which is private, and you'll also get early access to all of my videos. So I hope you guys will join me there, and I will see you in the next video. Happy smoking.